In the last video, we looked at how JavaScript objects can inherit from other objects using a special property called the prototype pointer. In this case, I'm able to call the toString method on child, even though it doesn't exist in the child's properties, because toString is defined in the parent. Normally, you don't assign the prototype property directly like this, because technically not all browsers are required to support it. Instead, you use something called a constructor function. Now, we've already looked at constructor functions as a way to construct objects. In other words, a way to add properties to the object quickly inside of a function. But we haven't looked at how we can use the same constructor function to set up inheritance. To start us off, I'm going to get rid of all of this code, and I'm going to create a constructor function called person. And we'll give the constructor function some parameters. We'll pass a first name and a last name. And if you recall from the constructor function video, we can initialize the object inside of this function. And so I can say the first name is going to be equal to whatever is passed in here. And the last name is also equal to the second parameter. And we can create a new instance of this person by using the new keyword and then calling the constructor function with whatever parameters we would like. When I save this over in the debugger, I should be able to type person and see that it has two properties, first name and last name. Let me show you a quick trick in the Chrome console debugger. Instead of just typing person, I can type console.dir directory, and for the parameter we'll pass in person. And what that does is it gives back the object with an arrow so we can dig into it and see what the various properties point to. So this is sort of like using the sources tab from before. So I've just drilled into the prototype property, and we're looking at some kind of object here that has a constructor property and its own prototype property. But what is this object and where did it come from? Well, it turns out that all functions in JavaScript have their own special property called prototype. And that property will point to an object. This gets created for us automatically no matter what we do. Let me try typing console.dir and we'll pass person. It actually just shows us the function, and the function should look similar to what we have over on the left there, but I can drill into it and see that it has this prototype property on it. So when we construct an object using a constructor function like this person constructor function, that object's prototype property automatically gets set equal to the object off of this prototype property of the function. To make this a little bit more clear, we can put some properties on this object and see it in action. I'm going to create a function or a property on the prototype object, which remember is created for us automatically, so I can just reference it like this. And this prototype object is going to be an object just like this. It would be just like if we had created it as an empty object, but since it's already created for us, we don't need to do this, and I can just add properties to it. I'm going to add one called toString. And similar to what we had before, this function is going to return the result of calling first name, and then a space, and then the last name. Let's start by taking a look at the person function itself. And this time, if I expand the prototype property, notice it now has three properties. It has the constructor property like it had before. And by the way, this constructor property just points right back at the original function. And the reason for that is so that we can just reference the original function. You'll see some uses for that later. And then we have this toString property, which we just added. And that's this function right here. Next, let's take a look at the person object that we created using the new keyword and the person constructor function. I'll type console.dir and pass in the person object and expand it. And what you can see is that this prototype pointer points to an object, and that object is the same thing as this object up here, which is pointed to by the prototype property of the function. And so I can type person to string like we did before, and we should get back a string that says evented space mind. Keeping track of all of this I found to be very confusing early on. And so I found it when I was learning that it's useful to think in terms of these tables that we've been creating all along. So if you remember, when we use this new keyword with a constructor function, the first thing that the JavaScript runtime does is create a new empty object. Then the second thing it does is it connects that object's prototype chain up to the function's prototype. And so this value here for the prototype property, this is going to be our new empty object here. And the value for that prototype property will be person, will be the object that's pointed to by person prototype. And so we might say that our new object inherits from the person's prototype object. So the second thing it will do is to set this prototype pointer. And then the third thing it does is it just calls the constructor function with the new object pointed to by this. And that gives us a chance to set some properties on the new object, like first name and last name. So I filled in these tables a bit, and we can see that the object that gets created, or the own object, has some new properties on it called first name and last name that were created at construction time. And its prototype pointer points up to this object here, which can have its own methods like toString, and that I've illustrated here. So a common pattern that you'll see in frameworks is to initialize any properties or state variables inside of the constructor function like this, and then put any shared functions that are going to be used by multiple instances or multiple objects that are constructed with this function. You can put those on the prototype object. And that will make them inherited by all of the objects that are created with this constructor. Now, admittedly, this is one of the most confusing aspects of JavaScript, especially if you're coming from a class-based language like C# or Java. What I'd recommend is that you play around with functions and objects in the JavaScript console until you feel like you have a good intuitive sense of what's going on. Just remember, most of the time we're just dealing with objects and initializing those objects with properties or setting up one object to inherit from another. In this case, we do that most often by using a constructor function and that constructor function's prototype object.